You just gonna set it up. I was just waiting for those horns. Should be coming soon, right? What you feeling down for? No, I like that. I like that. Just vibing right now. Don't be sad. Open your eyes. The sun is shining. The angels are dancing in heaven. You hear me?
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Father God, in your name I pray. Help the people find their way. Better days are coming by and by. We can make it if we try. Come on. Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Father God, in your name I pray. Help the people find their way. Look around and then I see a little old man and a homeless lady. They don't have no food to eat. Father, give them a warm place to sleep. Come on, wake up the people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up. Wake up. Wake up.
Wake up. Yes, greetings family. This is Brother Jegna here again for another Afrocentricity book show every Sunday between 4 and 6 p.m. I must remind you that the Afrocentricity book show is sponsored by Glass R Us, 7307 Sisters Road, N15 5NH. You can get Glass R Us on 0208 800 6663. That is Glass R Us on 0208 800 6663. Please go to Glass R Us for all your glazing needs. So we are reading the Black Book about the Black Jacobins, as I'm sure you know. We are maybe halfway through the book. Please remember, what you do for yourself depends on what you think of yourselves, and what you think of yourselves depends on what you know about yourself, and what we know about ourselves depends on what we are taught about ourselves. So the Afrocentricity book show is to educate us from the view of ourselves, from the view of African people, African-centered view, so we know what the truth is. Yeah, as black people, we've been lied to more than any other people on this planet, I think it's fair to say. So we have to know where we are. We have to know who we are. We have to know where we are coming from, and we have to know where we are going. That's the only way we can move forward, yeah, in life. So we are reading, as I'm sure you know, The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. It's a classic book, The Black Jacobins, subtitled Toussaint Louverture and the San Domingo Revolution. San Domingo is what is today called Haiti, and it was the first successful slave revolution in the history of the world. And the new nation was born on 1804, 1st of January. So we're reading about the whole situation which created that first nation, the first successful black nation in the Western Hemisphere in 1804. And it's a great situation, a great scenario for us all to learn from, because we see how our groups interacted, black groups, white groups, yeah, mixed race people, yeah, the politics of the age. It's very important to remember that these Africans who were formerly enslaved beat the Spanish, they beat the French, and they beat the British, the greatest three empires of the age. So when you think that, boy, I can't do that, these people pulled off the impossible. And why did they pull off the impossible? Because they went back to who they were. They saw the world through their own eyes as black people, as African people. And they went back to their own culture. And with using that, they were able to beat the three greatest empires of the age. So the impossible can be the impossible when you know yourself and you're looking at the world through your own eyes. So CLR James, the Black Jacobins, we on page 261. This is Brother Jegner. We are going to continue. So we'll soon be on the next chapter, but yeah, at the moment, to page 261. These were his views. He never changed them. This is Toussaint Louverture. He set his face sternly against the racial discrimination. He guarded his power and the rights of the laborers by an army overwhelmingly black. But within that, he was encouraged by all to come back, mulattoes and whites. I digress here. It's very important to know that within this army were blacks, mixed race people, and Europeans as well. Polish all came over to this side. So Toussaint Louverture at the moment is the most powerful person in the whole island of San Domingo. The policy was both wise and workable. And if his relations with France had been regularized, I'll get there in a minute, regularized, he would have done all that he hoped to do. But San Domingo did not know where it stood in relation to France. There were still fears of liberty, and the black laborers did not approve of Toussaint's policy. They felt that he showed too much favor to their old enemies. These anti-white feelings of the blacks were no infringement to the liberty and equality, but were in reality the sound revolutionary policy. It was fear of the counter-revolution. They had loved Sonafax, called down blessings on his head, and made their children pray for him at night. 50 years afterwards, their old eyes would glow as they told travellers of this wonderful white man who had given them liberty and equality, not only in words, but in deeds. But men like Sonafax, Vincent, Levay, and Room were few. And with the decline of the old revolution in France had come a man like Hedeville. The black labourers, these were the formerly enslaved, the black labourers had their eyes fixed on the local whites and resented Toussaint's policy. So if I digress here quickly, Toussaint really was a controller of the nation, but these formerly enslaved who are now free, Toussaint was running the island really as a French colony, but slavery was abolished. But he wanted all the former enslaved to go back onto the land and act as labourers. They were now paid now, but he still put some of the former slave masters on top of them, in control of them, and they were still acting the same way, very kind of racist, can we say, because that's how they're being grown. And many of the labourers, the black labourers now resented some of the treatment that they was receiving, even though they was being paid. It was the counter-revolution in France, but the blacks could see in the eyes of their former owners the regret for the old days and the hatred. Shortly after, Toussaint issued one of his stern proclamations, confirming to the blacks proclamations confining the blacks to the plantations. Some of these whites issued proclamations of their own to the labourers. You say that you are free, yet you are going to be forced to come back to my house, and there I shall treat you as before, and show you that you are not free. This was a spirit which so constantly provoked massacres of the whites. Toussaint confined the culprits heavily, ordered that all who could not pay should be imprisoned, even women, and reduced such officers as were concerned to their ranks. But he still continued to favour the whites. Every white woman was entitled to come to all the circles. Only the wives of the highest black officials could come. White women were called Madame. The black woman was a citizen. Losing sight of this mass support, taking it for granted, he sought only to conciliate the whites at home and abroad. What would Bonaparte do? Toussaint, pursuing his policy, made gestures of friendship to all abroad. Madame de Beauharnais, Josephine's mother, Josephine was the sister of Bonaparte. Josephine's mother had a plantation at Leogain. After the evacuation of the British, Josephine wrote to Toussaint about the plantation, which was in ruins. Her correspondence began. Toussaint repaired and restored the plantation at the expense of the colony, and sent the revenues to Madame Bonaparte. Josephine befriending his two boys, and they went often to luncheon and dinner at her house. But Toussaint wanted his sons back, and Bonaparte would not send them. Toussaint prepared for the inevitable war. That was one of the reasons which drove him to demand that his generals be mercilessly strict with the labourers. He bought 30,000 guns from America. He armed the labourers. At reviews, he would snatch a gun and wave it and shout, "Here is your liberty." He was not afraid to arm the masses. He trusted them, for he had no interest apart from theirs. He hid stocks of ammunition and supplies in secret places in the interior. He called up the able-bodied for military training and drilled a regular army. Bold in innovation, he introduced a system of commands by whistles. In every conceivable way, except one, he prepared. The blacks would have to fight. The war would devastate San Domingo, as no war had ever devastated it before. Ruin his work and let loose barbarians and savagery again. This time on an unprecedented scale. But any large expedition could have no other aim than the restoration of slavery. In that cruel dilemma, he worked feverishly, hoping against hope, writing to Bonaparte, begging for skilled workmen, teachers, administrators to help him govern the colony. Bonaparte will not answer, and Toussaint could guess why. If Bonaparte wrote a personal letter, he would have to either accept or condemn. If he accepted, then Toussaint's position would receive the final sanction. If he condemned, then Toussaint would openly declare independence and perhaps clinch a bargain with the British, if one were not made already. Toussaint, however, immediately after the victory in the south, this is the victory against the mulatto people, which we would call a mixed race today, he had decided to regularize his own position and put an end to internal troubles for the future of giving San Domingo a constitution. For this purpose, he summoned an assembly of 6 men, one from each province, consisting of rich whites and mulattoes, and there was not one black. As always, he was thinking of the effect in France, and not to the effect of his own masses. Feelings too sure of them. The members of the assembly were merely figureheads. The Constitution is Toussaint Louverture's from the first line to the last, and in it enshrined his principles of government. Slavery was forever abolished. Every man, whatever his colour, was admissible to all the employments, and there was to exist no other distinction than that of virtue and talents, and no other superiority than that which the law gives in the exercise of the public functions. He incorporated in the Constitution an article which preserved the rights to all proprietors absent from the colony, for whatever reason, except if they were on the list of the immigrés proscribed in France. For the rest, Toussaint concentrated all power in his own hands. Every municipal administration was composed of a mayor and 4 administrators. They were nominated by the governor for 2 years from a list of 16 submitted to him. The church was strictly subordinate to the state. The governor apportioned to each minister of religion the extent of his administration, and the clergy were not allowed under any pretext whatever to form an association in the colony. Laws were to be preceded by this formula. The Central Assembly in San Domingo, on the proposal of the governor, they were promulgated with the formula: the governor commands. Every department of administration, finance, police, army were confided to him, and he correspondingly directed with France on everything relating to the colony. He had the censorship of all printed matter. The Central Assembly could accept or reject laws, but the Assembly was in the hands of the governor, being elected by the principal administrators whom he had nominated. The Constitution appointed Toussaint's governor for life, with power to name his successor. Constitutions are what they turn out to be. France in 1802 could have no quarrel with Toussaint over his constitution in the score of his despotism. What would strike any Frenchman, however, was that the constitution, though swearing allegiance to France, left no room for any French official. Toussaint wanted them to come out and help him govern, but under the local government. It was a virtual independence, with France the elder brother, guide and mentor. He had no precedents to guide him, but he knew what he wanted. He remonstrated with, as it were, to the place of France in such a government. He replied, "The French government will send commissioners to speak with me. Absolute local independence on one hand, but on the other hand, French capital and French administrators helping to develop and educate the country, and a high official from France as a link between both governments." The local power was too well safeguarded for us to call the scheme a protectorate in the political context. All the evidence shows that Toussaint, working alone, had reached forward to that form of political allegiance which we know today as a dominion status. Firm was his grasp of reality, old Toussaint looked beyond San Domingo with a boldness of imagination surpassed by no contemporary. In the Constitution, he authorized the slave trade because the island needed people to cultivate it. When the Africans landed, however, they would be free men, but while loaded with the cares of the government, he cherished to project a sailing to Africa with arms, ammunition, and 1,000 of his best soldiers, and there conquering vast tracts of country, putting an end to the slave trade and making millions of blacks free. And French, as his constitution, had made the blacks of San Domingo. It was no dream. He had sent millions of francs to America to wait for the day when he would be ready. He was already 55. What spirit was it that moved him? Ideas do not fall from heaven. The great revolution had propelled him out of his humble joys and obscure destiny, and the trumpets of his heroic period rang over his ears, rang ever in his ears. In him, born a slave, and the leaders of slaves, The concrete realization of liberty, equality, and eternity was the womb of ideas and the springs of power which overflowed from their narrow environment and embraced the whole fraternity, which overflowed their narrow environment and embraced the whole of the world, I should say. But for the revolution, this extraordinary man and his band of gifted associates would have lived out their lives as slaves, serving the commonplace creatures would have owned them, standing barefooted and in rags to watch inflated little governors and mediocre officials from Europe pass by, as many a talented African stands in Africa today. So it's important to say that Toussaint had ideas of taking ships and going to Africa and abolishing slavery in the whole of African continent, which is something not widely spoken about. Too much importance has been attached to the Constitution. It was merely a formal embodiment of the position of Toussaint. Had been moving steadily since the expulsion of Hedeville. He was a former French European commissioner. His method of publishing, it was as usual one of a mystery. He summoned his white and mulatto assembly to prepare the document. He then left them out of it and set off to capture Spanish San Domingo. On his return, the Constitution was ready. Nobody knew its contents except himself and the assembly. He suddenly told Vincent that he would allow him to leave for France if he would take the Constitution to Bonaparte. Vincent agreed because there seemed to be no chance of getting away otherwise. Toussaint told him to go to Gonaïves and bid Madame Louverture goodbye. Vincent being very friendly with the family. As soon as Vincent left, Toussaint published the Constitution in July 1801. And there was a religious ceremony, a great banquet, and illuminations of public rejoicing. Toussaint's Constitution was a despotism, i.e. because he had complete control over it. Public rejoicing, and the mulattoes and the free blacks did not like it. But what cared those thousands who sang and danced? When Vincent returned, he went to Toussaint and reproached him for publishing so far-reaching a document without the sanction of the French government. And when he saw the details, he was horrified. He consulted Pascal, and both agreed that Toussaint ought to withdraw it. They might as well have asked the island of San Domingo to withdraw itself from the Caribbean Sea and attach itself to France. So I must remind you, this is the Afrocentricity Brook Show. This is Brother Jegna. We are reading The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. Toussaint listened very patiently. There was no room in it for any official from France, and Vincent said, "France will send commissioners to speak to me." Said Toussaint, "What is really required is that France send you a charge d'affaires, and ambassadors, and the Americans and the Spaniards will certainly do, and even the British." This was a crude innuendo. Even Vincent at times suspected Toussaint. How difficult it was for them to understand that Toussaint was using the British and playing the diplomatic game with them, but detested these bulwarks of European reaction just as much as any other true son of the revolution. "I know the English government is the most dangerous to me and the most perfidious to France. It did all it could to get the sole rights of trade with the island, but I gave them only what I could not help giving. I needed it, but doesn't Bonaparte write to me? He asks Vincent, he writes to the King of England. Pascal, until this time, another devoted follower who disapproved of the Constitution, and Toussaint dropped him. Vincent complained to Moyes and Christophe, and they also condemned it. Christophe said Toussaint had gone too far, and Moise called Toussaint an old fool. He thinks he's the king of Saint Domingo. The printing of the Constitution particularly startled Vincent. To have it printed meant, in those days, that an irrevocable decision had been taken. Toussaint agreed. It would have cost him nothing to send a written copy, but he was going his way. There was only one last painful interview between the two men. Vincent did all he could to make Toussaint reconsider his actions. All the blacks were free. He could not withdraw the right of governing Ireland from France. Give me your list of comrades in arms who have contributed to the driving out of the English and restoring cultivation, the government. I am certain I'll prove them its gratitude. Toussaint, usually calm, was violently agitated. He replied that he would see with infinite pleasure some of his comrades rewarded. But when Vincent asked him what he wanted for himself, he replied sharply that he wanted nothing, that he knew of his destruction was the ultimate aim, and that his children would never enjoy the little that he had amassed, but that he was not yet the victim of his enemies. To his personal outburst, he added some reflections which so hurt the conscience of the sensitive Vincent that he would not even write them down, but we can guess what they were. Bitterness at the insults and the neglect which he felt were caused by his colour, an impossible position in which he and his people were placed, submission which would mean the restoration of slavery, or defiance which would mean war, and the complete devastation of the island, its isolation, white and black friend against him. All these must have wrung the words out of him, who ordinarily never spoke. But when he thought it necessary, and he said only what he wanted to say, he turned abruptly from Vincent and evaded the 100 persons who were waiting for him. He sprang on his horse and he rode away so quickly that even his guard was taken by surprise. For these few weeks Vincent seems to have doubted Toussaint. Vincent was a white man. He could never dread slavery as a black man could never have the unsleeping fear of white treachery so strong in that generation in Saint Domingo Africans. Honest himself, Vincent took it for granted that the rulers of France would act with common decency towards black men whose services to France he had witnessed. To him it seemed that Toussaint was merely pursuing a personal ambition. Before he left Christophe, would he leave Le Cap? Where would he have commanded it to go to Saint Iago to welcome the French expedition, which would certainly come? It would save a great deal of trouble. Christophe, evasive, said he would do his best for peace. With this unequivocal answer, Vincent had to be satisfied. He did not want to know what to do. He went home to America, and from Philadelphia he wrote to Toussaint, warning him against the projects of independence. Vincent did all this man could do. He even tried to discharge Christophe from Toussaint. He was acting as if he thought that the best interest of Saint Domingo and France. To him, the restoration of slavery was unthinkable. He expected it as little as 1 million of British people expected the intrigues of Baldwin, Hoare and Eden, with Laval and Mussolini. After the denial of arms to Abyssinia, and the Guazois and the Grandois promises of fidelity to the League of Nations, and the idea of a collective security, many an honest subordinate has in this way been the unwilling instrument of the inevitable treachery from above. The trouble is that when faced with the brutal reality, he goes in to the end with his own side, and by very confidence, with his integrity created, does not infinitely more harm than the open enemy. So that is the end of chapter 11. The next chapter is chapter 12. The bourgeoisie prepares to restore slavery. And this is the Afrocentricity Book Show. Chapter 12. The bourgeoisie prepares to restore slavery. Toussaint was perfectly right in his suspicions. What is the regime under which the colonies have prospered? Asked Bonaparte. And on the being, he told the ancient regime, he decided to restore it. Slavery and mulatto discrimination. Bonaparte hated blacks. The revolution had appointed that brave and brilliant mulatto, General Dumas, commander-in-chief of one of his armies. But Bonaparte detested him for his colour and persecuted him. So let me say, Dumas was one of the big generals in Napoleon's army. But Dumas himself had a lot of fans. Yeah, there's a lot of celebrity. But Bonaparte hated this. Bonaparte was a very racist man, it must be added, yeah. You never learned this at school, but he was extremely racist as well. Bonaparte never spoke to Toussaint. He thought, Toussaint, who's Toussaint? Well, he's just a slave, yeah. And Dumas, you must remember, Dumas, his grandchild, was the great Dumas who wrote the Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo. So his grandfather was a great general in Napoleon's army. Yet Bonaparte was no colonist, and his anti-African bias was far from influencing his major policies. He wanted profits from his supporters, and the clamorous colonists found in him a ready heir. The bourgeoisie of the maritime towns wanted the fabulous province of the old days, the passionate desire to free all humanity, which had called for Negro freedom in the great days of the Revolution, now huddled in the slums of Paris and Marseille, exhausted by its great efforts, and terrorized by Bonaparte's bayonets and Fouché's police. But the abolition of slavery was one of the proudest memories of the Revolution, and much more important, the San Domingo blacks had an army and leaders trained to fight in the European manner. These were no savage tribesmen with spears, against whom European soldiers armed with rifles could win undying glory. Occupied with his European campaigns, Bonaparte never lost sight of San Domingo, as he never lost sight of anything. His officers presented plan after plan, but the British fleet and the unknown strength of the blacks prevented action. Yet early in March 1801, a shift in his policy nearly compelled him to leave Toussaint in complete charge of San Domingo. Bonaparte aimed at India, and having missed his first spring by way of Egypt, he won over the Tsar Paul, and these two arranged to march overland and steal from the British what these had stolen from the Indians. Bonaparte could not fight on two hemispheres at once. On March the 4th, he wrote a letter to Toussaint, beaming with goodwill. He had been busy, but now that peace was near, and he had time to read Toussaint's letters, he would appoint him Captain General of the island. He asked Toussaint to develop agriculture and build up the armed forces. The time, this is in speech marks, the time I hope will not be far when a division from San Domingo will be able to contribute in your part in the world to the glory and the possession of the Republic. But British bourgeoisie driven out of America now fully realised the importance of India. Pitt, this is Prime Minister, Pitt, in collusion with Paul's son Alexander, organised the murder of the pro-French Paul. 7 days after the letter to Toussaint was written, Paul was strangled, and on the following day the British fleet sailed into the Baltic. When Bonaparte heard this, he knew at once that Pitt had beaten him, and the Indian raid was off. The letter and instructions to Toussaint were never sent. Bonaparte prepared to destroy Toussaint. It is Toussaint's supreme merit that while he saw European civilizations as a valuable and necessary thing, he strove to lay the foundations. He strove to lay its foundations among his people. He never had the illusion that it conferred any moral superiority. He knew French, British, Spanish imperialists for the insatiable gangsters that they were, that there is no oath too sacred for them to break, no crime, deception, treachery, cruelty, destruction of human life and property, which they would not commit against all those who could not defend themselves. So it's very important. They're saying that here, that Toussaint, he knew the British, the Spanish and French, these people are just gangsters, and they'll make any promise and break any promise. These people, it's very important to read. I digress here. It's very important to read the book called The Prince. The book called The Prince, really explains the European mind, that any means is good to get any ends. Machiavellian, The Prince by Machiavelli. In the book, it lays out basically the European kind of concepts of their politics. They'll do anything. They'll sell their own mother to become king. They do not mind doing anything. So there's nothing that they will not break. And this is why I say, understanding the French Revolution, understanding the Toussaint and Saint Domingo and Bonaparte really explains the world, opens our eyes to the realities of the world as we see it today. South Africa is a very similar thing as well. Mandela, in effect, left the Europeans there in charge of everything. And as you see what's happening today, they're just the same racist people when they thought that Toussaint was there. Toussaint, my apology, when they thought Mandela was going to maybe kick them out. And they said, oh, Mandela, we love you, and we love you, Mandela. But love Mandela, because Mandela left them with all their stolen goods and their power. And if you see where they're acting today, these people haven't changed. So it hasn't changed at all. So it's a similar thing there. If the Africans and Mandela's people, Mandela's government, understood this Toussaint revolution, they'll see that these people do not change. The only way they change is if they're forced to change. And even them, they do not change. They only do what they need to do. So let me continue. When Vincent arrived, so Vincent was obviously in Saint Domingo. When Vincent arrived in Paris, preparations were well underway. But the Constitution gave Bonaparte a convenient excuse. Poor Vincent had attempted to persuade Toussaint to give way to Bonaparte by condemning the Constitution as treason. He now tried to persuade Bonaparte to give way to Toussaint by denying that the Constitution was treason. Bonaparte accused Toussaint of being sold to the British. Stoutly, Vincent defended him. Bonaparte swore at Vincent, cursed at gilded Africans, and that he would not have an epaulette on his shoulder of a single nigger in the colony. Vincent put it to him that Britain might assist Toussaint. Bonaparte boasted that Britain had shown some inclination to oppose the expedition, but when he threatened to clothe Toussaint with unlimited powers and acknowledging his independence, the British had kept silence. Bonaparte thought that they dreaded the effect of an independent Saint Domingo on their own slave colony in Jamaica. But Pitt, Dundas and Maitland were all laughing in their sleeves and rubbing their hands in anticipation. Vincent tried to point out the dangers of the expedition. Bonaparte called Toussaint a revolted slave, called Vincent a coward, and drove him from his presence. Vincent was appalled at Bonaparte's violence. If this was the spirit in which the French were going to Saint Domingo, they were heading for a fall. As anxious now for France as for Saint Domingo, he took the bold step of addressing a memoir to the minister. in which he tried to paint the strength of the colony and the extraordinary genius of the man who ruled there, obviously Toussaint. At the head of so, this is speech marks, at the head of so many resources is a man, the most active and tireless of whom one can possibly have any idea. It is the strictest truth to say that he is everywhere and above all in that spot where there is a sound judgment and danger make it essential for him to be. His great sobriety, the faculty accorded to him alone of never taking a rest, the advantage he enjoys of being able to start at once with the work in his office after wearisome journeys, of replying to 100 letters a day and tiring out his secretaries more than that, the art of tantalizing and confusing everybody, even to deceit. All this makes him a man so superior to all around him that respect and submission reach the limits of fanaticism in a vast number of heads. He has imposed on his brothers in San Domingo a power without bounds. He is the absolute master of the island, and nothing can counteract his wishes. Whatever they may be, although some distinguished men, but very few blacks among them, know what are his plans and view them with great fear. Vincent described Toussaint as a superior to everyone in San Domingo. But if one reads the extract again, it becomes clear that this brave, honest, intelligent and experienced officer was obviously describing the most extraordinary human being he had ever met in his life, and the powers beyond which he thought possible, with powers that he thought beyond possible. In the writings of his contemporaries, describing the greatest figure of the French Revolution and Napoleon's era, one finds this note of astonishment. This I can't believe my own eyes attitude in writings only come from three men: Bonaparte, Nelson, the sailor, and Toussaint. Bonaparte was so angry that he banished Vincent to the island of Elba. So I think what he's saying there, that Bonaparte, this guy's Toussaint, is your equal. And Toussaint obviously angry, because to Toussaint, to my apologies, to Bonaparte, Toussaint is just a nigger, a gilded nigger at that, yeah? So not really a person of gold, but just gilded nigger. So he banished this person, Vincent, to an island, and he did this to a lot of people. Personally loved and respected by all, by their contemporaries, Vincent and Bivet fail, as will fail all who do not understand that in a revolution each must choose his side and stick to it. But although Bonaparte might shout nigger at the best slave-owning manner, the more than anyone in France, he divined the difficulties. At first, he had thought it easy, the colonist who had fled in the early days of the revolution, thought of the slaves as a motley crowd of black brigands who would fly at the first sight of a white man. How could such coward and trembled niggers be ever anything else? They had defeated the British. Nonsense. That was fever. General Michel and the last commissioner, who had not seen Toussaint's armies in action, called his officers a collection of conceited incompetents. But Room, Pascal and Vincent all of whom liked the blacks, and therefore knew that they were what they were capable of, were against any expedition. Pascal said that the more enlightened the blacks, i.e. those who had been free before the revolution, did not love Toussaint, but 49/5 of the population followed him blindly, regarding him as an inspired of being inspired by God. Room's attitude was most astonishing. Room was not even a Frenchman, but a Creole from Tobago. Yet, despite his rough treatment at the hands of Toussaint, still retained his belief in Toussaint's devotion to France. He wrote that Toussaint had acted irregularly because of his fear of slavery. Let Bonaparte clothe him with his full and civil power and reassure him about the future. At the end of the war, he would hand back the colony. Malufent, an old colonist, who was now an official in San Domingo, was offered a post in the expedition. He drafted a memorandum full of praise for Toussaint and the labourers, and warned Bonaparte against the catastrophe which he was preparing. When he met Leclerc, the Captain General, a few days before the fleet sailed, Leclerc accused him of cowardice. All the niggers, when they see an army, will lay down their arms. They will be only too happy that we pardon them. You are misformed, General. But there is a colonist who has offered to arrest Toussaint in the interior of the country with 60 grenadiers. He is bolder than I, for I would not attempt it with 60,000 men. He is very rich, Toussaint. He has more than 40 millions. Patiently, Malufent pointed out to him that it was impossible for Toussaint to have this sum. Malufent shared Room's opinion of Toussaint. He said afterwards that if Bonaparte had sent Levet to San Domingo with 3,000 men, all would have been well. Toussaint was an eminently reasonable man. Excuse me, I just had to cough. Toussaint was an eminently reasonable man, and he and Levet would have worked out a modus vivendi, whereby France, the French capital, would have had full opportunity in the island. It was not to be. Leclerc, by the way, is Napoleon's brother-in-law. Leclerc pooh-poohed Malufent's remonstrations and dismissed him. Bonaparte never had such a foolish ideas. Vincent, he had been told the strength of Toussaint's army, with his officers and soldiers, and tried and experienced by 10 years of constant fighting, and with the great soldiers added more and more men to the force. So as to avoid too much talk, he distributed his preparations in every harbour of France, Holland and Belgium. The preliminaries of the peace were signed in October the 1st, 1801. 8 days after Bonaparte gave his word, and even delay of adverse winds held up their petition until December the 14th. It was the largest expedition that had ever sailed from France, consisting of 20,000 veteran troops under some of Bonaparte's ablest officers. The chief of staff was Dugua, whom Bonaparte had left in charge of Egypt when they set out for the march of Palestine. Boudet was in command of an advance guard of Dessaix, whose last-minute attack had saved Bonaparte from disastrous defeat at Marengo. Boyer had commanded the noble guards which patrolled Upper Egypt. Humbert had commanded the expedition against Ireland. There were men who had experience of guerrilla warfare in La Vendée. General Pamphile Lacroix, who sailed with the expedition and wrote a valuable history of the campaigns and the San Domingo Revolution, has left his opinion. So this is in speech marks. The army of Leclerc was composed of an infinite number of soldiers with great talents, good strategists, great technicians, officers of engineers and artillery, who were well educated and very resourceful. So basically, I digress here. Napoleon is sending his best troops to San Domingo to put down these black people. These troops are the troops who beat all the best armies in Europe, Egypt, and you name it. So he's sending his best troops here to put down Toussaint and his Africans once and for all. So the army of Leclerc was composed of infinite number of soldiers with great talent, good strategists, great technicians, officers and engineers and artillery, well educated and very resourceful. At the last moment, Bonaparte changed the command, putting his brother-in-law Leclerc at his head, a sign of the importance he attached to the venture. Pauline, Leclerc's wife, that's Bonaparte's sister, and their sons went with the expedition. He carried musicians, artists, and all of the paraphernalia of a court. Slavery would be re-established, civilization restarted, and a good time will be had by all. So isn't that a contradiction? Slavery will be re-established and civilization restarted. So civilized life is enslavement. I digress. Let me move on. This is the Afrocentricity Book Show, and this is Brother Jegna reading The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. And in these last crucial months, Toussaint, fully aware of Bonaparte's preparation, was busy sawing off a branch on which he sat. In the north, around Plaisance, Limbé, Doudoine, the vanguard of the revolution was not satisfied with the new regime. Toussaint's discipline was hard, but it was infinitely better than the old slavery. What of these old revolutionary blacks objected to was the working for their white masters. Moise was the commandant of the northern province, and Moise sympathized with the blacks. Work, yes, but not for whites. Whatever my old uncle may do, I cannot bring myself to be the executioner of my colour. It is always in the interest of the metropolis that he scolds me, but these interests are those of the whites, and I shall only love them when they have given me back the eye that they made me lose in battle. So that is Moise is the nephew of Toussaint, and Moise is siding with the blacks because the whites are put back in charge of the blacks, really, even though the blacks are being paid, but they cannot take the racial oppression. So I'm going to take a short break now. This is Brother Jegna of Afrocentricity Book Show every Sunday between 4 and 6. I must remind you that this show is sponsored by Glass Are Us. You can get Glass Are Us on 0208 800 6663. That is Glass Are Us. 0208 800 6663. You can go to Glass Are Us for all of your glazing needs. If you mention the show, you'll get a nice discount. Just mention Afrocentricity Book Show. So we're going to take a short break here now, okay? I'll be back after the short musical break.
Of a celebration of life, death, and the struggles of our ancestors. Check it out. Let me hear you say, whoa, whoa, yeah, yeah, whoa, whoa, yeah, yeah, whoa, yeah, whoa, yeah, whoa, yeah, whoa, yeah, whoa, whoa, yeah, yeah, whoa, whoa, yeah, yeah, whoa, yeah, whoa, yeah, whoa, yeah, whoa, yeah. Maybe she was demonstrating, but nevertheless I was pleased. My day was going great and my soul was at ease until a group of brothers started bugging out, drinking the 40 ounce, going the nigger out, disrespecting my black queen, holding their crotches and being obscene. At first I ignored them, cause see I know the type. They got drunk, they got guns, and yes they wanna fight. And they see a young couple having a time that's good, and the egos wanna test the brother's manhood.
fashion misfit. And the outfit that I'm wearing, brothers dissing it. While I stay calm and pray the niggas leave me be. But they squeeze parts of my date's anatomy. Why, Lord, you brothers have to drill me? Cause if I start to hit this man, they'll have to kill me. You see, I am everyday people. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You see, I am everyday people. I told the niggas, please let us pass friends. I said please cause I don't like killing Africans. But he wouldn't stop, and I ain't Ice Cube. But I had to take the brother out for being rude. And like I said before, I was mad by then. It took 3 or 4 cops to pull me off the hill. But that's the story, y'all, of a black man acting like a nigga. Niggas don't buy an African. You see,
there was good and evil. We chose good. Why raise the time of the Most High, ye sons of men? The rich man's wealth is in the city, yeah. Destruction of the poor is his poverty, Lord. Destruction of your soul is vanity. They keep fighting me, I'm not giving up. May the realms of science fill my spiritual cup. Wisdom overstanding must never be too much. Give I protection day and night from even the pestilence that walk at that daylight. Destiny, mama, look from where destruction, restraining the Edens with a rod of iron. You know not the destiny of a next man, why hold him? Set him free for too long. I wanna rule my destiny. Oh yeah, I really wanna rule my destiny. Hear me call, call, call. Destiny, mama look from when you calling. Destiny, mama look from when you calling. I wanna rule my destiny. Oh, hey, help I please. I wanna rule my destiny. Where could I found? My destination is homeward bound. No forces try hold I down. Breaking chains has become the norm. I know I must get through, no matter what I want. Destiny, mama look from when you calling. Destiny, mama look from when you calling. Let me rule my destiny, Lord. And I tell you once more, the rich man's wealth is in the city. Oh, destruction of the poor is our poverty. Yeah, destruction of her soul is vanity. Oh, do you wear? Do you wear? Whoa, whoa, destiny, destiny.
In times like these, war is not the answer, 'cause only love can conquer. Yeah, yeah. Let him live, no resist. Why resistance is getting weaker? I just can't stand the pressure. My mind is getting weaker. I've got to find some other pleasure. I need nothing to be a man, because I was born a man, and I deserve the right to live like any other man. Yeah. Oh, any other man. My mind in such a state. Thank God I've got some life left. I'm getting of a sudden, my soul stands aggressed. I need nothing to be a man, because I was born a man, and I deserve the right to live like any other man. Oh, any other man. Lord, I wanna be any other man. Ooh, Lord have mercy. Misfortune is having me down. Sometimes it makes me sick. At times I try to hate, but I just don't know the trick. I need nothing to be a man, because I was born a man, and I deserve the right to live like any other man. To live just like any other man. Lord, I wanna live a good life. Love life like any other.
Oh, yeah. Everyone's your relative, everything is relative, yeah.
We learn when we're young. Practice what's taught when you're older. Everything that's done plays a part as a molder. Fathers teach your sons, mothers teach your daughters. Show them what's to come, what the world has to offer. It starts with the family, it starts with the family. We all are family, one human family. It starts with the family, it starts with the family. We all are family, one human family.
We'll be, yeah, making all the changes in society. You'll see, oh, the home, the first nursery. Now many men say blood is thicker than water. But when you're thirsty, it's not blood that you ask for. So when you've got true friends, regard them as your brothers and sisters. Folks don't understand. They say that we're complete strangers, but we all are family. We all are family. Oh, so strengthen the family. Strengthen the family. We all are family. One human family. We all are family. Strengthen the family. We'll be making all the changes in society. You'll see, oh, the home, the first nursery. We'll be, oh, making all the changes in society. You'll see, yeah, the home, the first nursery. Everything is relative, everyone's your relative, yeah. Everything is relative, everyone's your relative, yeah. So check the air you breathe and the blood you bleed. You'll see that we one family, one heartbeat. In a you one me, I and I stand free. One family, every color and creed, one nationality. Sun shines for we, one family. Same moon for I, same trees for we, same stars they be. One family. Oh. It starts with the family.
It starts with the family.
We all are family. Strengthen you and me. We'll be, yeah, making all the changes in society. You'll see, yes you will. The home, first nursery. We'll be, yeah, making all the changes in society. You'll see, oh, it's the first nursery. Everything is relative, everyone's your relative, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Everything is relative, everyone's your relative, yeah.
It starts with the family. It starts with the family. We all are family. One human family. Oh, it starts with the family. It starts with the family. Oh,
everything is
we all are family.
Everyone's your relative,
one human family.
Everything is relative, everyone's your relative, yeah.
Starts with the family.
Everything is relative, everyone's your relative, yeah.
Just check the air you breathe, the blood you bleed.
Everything is relative, everyone's your relative,
one
yeah.
human family. Strengthen the family. Strengthen the family.
Yes, greetings, Brother Jegan, back again. This is the Afrocentricity Book Show. I just must remind you, I'll just tell you that on the 24th of April, on Wednesday 24th of April, about 3 weeks' time, there is an excellent show happening at the Ma'at Center 366A High Road, Tottenham. So there is a double bill being put on of 2 films. So one is called Catch a Fire, which is the story of Paul Bogle, and the second one is Marcus Garvey, a giant of black politics. So there is a screen of 2 videos, there's double bill on the evening on Wednesday the 24th of April 2019 at the Ma'at Centre, 366 High Road, Tottenham, N17 9HQ. You can buy tickets online by going to Just Tickets, so JUS-tickets, and it's £8 for a ticket here. So it starts at 7 o'clock in the evening till 10. So there'll be a discussion after the screening of the 2 films, but 2 excellent films about the great national heroes of Jamaica. These are the main 2, Marcus Garvey and Paul Bogle. If you're familiar with the Morant Bay Rebellion, you'll find out all about that as well, okay? So again, this is a double bill happening at the Ma'at Centre, 366A, Tottenham High Road, N17 9HT. This is Wednesday the 24th of April, 7 till 10 o'clock. So you can go to Just Tickets, JUS-tickets, to get your tickets. Okay, so this is the Afrocentricity Book Show, and remind you that this show is sponsored by Glass R Us. So we're going to continue now reading The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. So, gone were the days when Toussaint Overture would leave the front and ride through the night and inquire into the grievances of his labourers, and, though protecting the whites, make the labourers see that he was their leader. Revolutionaries through and through, these bold men, own brothers of the Cordels in Paris and Viborg workers in Petrograd, organised another insurrection. Their aim was to massacre the whites, overthrow Toussaint's government, and, some hope, put Moyes in place. Every observer, and Toussaint himself, thought that the labourers were following him because of his past services and his unquestioned superiority. This insurrection proved that they were following him because he represented that complete emancipation from their former degradation, which was their chief goal. As soon as they saw that he was no longer going to this end, they were ready to throw him off. This was in no way no mere riot, or just a few discontented or lazy blacks. It was a widespread riot in the north. The revolutionaries chose a time when Toussaint was away at Petit Riviere, attending the wedding of Dessalines. The movement should have begun in Le Cap. Le Cap is like the major city, the larger city. It began at Le Cap in September 21st. But Christophe heard of it just in time to check the first outbursts in the various quarters of the town. On the 22nd and 23rd, the revolt burst into the revolutionary districts of Marmalade, Plaisance, Limbe, Port Margot, and Dedon, home of the famous regiment. On the morning of the 23rd, it broke out again in Le Cap, while armed bands, killing all the whites whom they met on the way, appeared in the suburbs to make contact with those in the town. Christophe defeated these. Toussaint and Dessalines marched against the rising Marmalade and Dordogne, and it fell to pieces before him and his terrible lieutenant. Moyes, avoiding a meeting with Toussaint, attacked and defeated another band, but the blacks in certain districts had revolted to the cry of "Long live Moyes!" Toussaint, remember Moyes, he's Toussaint's nephew. Toussaint therefore had him arrested and would not allow the military tribunal even to hear him. The documents, he said, were enough. I flatter myself that the commissioners will not delay a judgment so necessary to the tranquility of the colony. He was afraid that Moyes might supplant him. Upon this hint, the commission gave judgment, and Moyes was shot. He died as he had lived. He stood before the place of execution in the presence of the troops of the garrison, and, in a firm voice, he gave the word to the firing squad, "Fire, my friends, fire." What exactly did Moyes stand for? We shall never know. 40 years after his death, Madou, The Haitian historian gave an outline of Moyes' program, whose authenticity, however, has been questioned. Toussaint refuses to break up the large estates. Moyes wanted small grants of land for junior officers and even a rank and file. Toussaint favoured the whites against the mulattoes. Moyes sought to build an alliance between the blacks and the mulattoes. Against the French, it is certain, it is certain that he had a strong sympathy for the labourers and hated the old slave owners. But he was not anti-white. He bitterly regretted the indignities to which he had been forced to submit room, and we know how highly he esteemed they held Sonothax. We have very little to go on, but it seems to have been a singularly attractive and possibly profound person. The old slave owners hated him, and they pressed Toussaint to get rid of him. Christophe too was jealous of Moyes, and Christophe loved white society. Guilty or not guilty of treason, Moyes had too many enemies to escape the implications of the "Long live Moyes" shouted by the revolutionaries. To the blacks of the North, already angry at Toussaint's policy, the execution of Moyes was a final disillusionment. He could not understand it. As was and is inevitable, they thought in terms of colour. After Toussaint himself, Moyes, his nephew, symbolised the revolution. He was who had led the labourers against Hedeville. He had also led the insurrection and which extorted the authority from Rome to take the Spanish San Domingo, an insurrection which to the labourers had been for the purpose of stopping the Spanish traffic in slaves. Moyes had arrested Rome, and later Vincent, and now Toussaint had shot him for taking the part of the blacks against the whites. Toussaint recognised his error. If the break with the French and Vincent had shaken him from his usual calm in the last interview, it was nothing of the remorse which now moved him after the execution of Moyes. None who knew him had ever seen him so agitated. He tried to explain it away in a long proclamation. Moyes was the soul of the insurrection. Moyes was a young man of loose habits. It was useless. Moyes had stood too high in the councils for too long. So set Toussaint that he could only think of further repression. Why would blacks support Moyes against him? That question he did not stop to ask, or, if he did, failed to appreciate the answer. In the districts of the insurrection, he shot without mercy. He lined up the labourers and spoke to them in turn, and on the basis of stumbling answer, of uncertainty, he decided who should be shot. He cowed by his power, they submitted. He published a series of laws surpassing in severity anything which he had yet decreed. He introduced a rigid passport system for all classes of the population. He confined the labourers to the plantations more strictly than ever before, and he made the managers and foremen responsible for the law under pain of imprisonment. Anyone fomenting disorder could be condemned to 6 months' hard labour, with a weight attached to his foot by a chain. He prohibited the soldiers from visiting the plantation, except to see their fathers and mothers, and then only for a limited period. He was now afraid of the contact between the revolutionary army and the people, an infallible sign of a revolutionary degeneration. And while he broke the morale of the black masses, he laboured to reassure the whites. Some of them rejoiced openly at the rumours of the expedition, and Toussaint, instead of treating them as he had treated the labourers, barely deported them. There were others, we need not doubt, who, holding the same views, thought it wiser to keep their mouths shut. A substantial number, however, accepted the new order and viewed with dismay the violence and destruction which they knew was inevitable if a French expedition came. Some began to leave and ask for passports. One of the most notable Creoles in San Domingo, a man of good education and judgment, who fully accepted the new San Domingo, came to Toussaint and asked him for a passport. Here's what Toussaint dreaded: the breakup of an unstable regime before it had a chance to acquire cohesion. He went quickly to the door to see that he was not likely to be overheard. And then coming back, he looked at the Nogari full in the face and asked him, "Why do you want to go? You whom I esteem and love. Because I am white, and notwithstanding the kindly feelings you have for me, I see that you are about to become irritated chief of the blacks." With some injustice, he accused Toussaint of deporting those whites who were rejoiced at the coming of the expedition. Toussaint justified his action with warmth. They have had the impudence and folly to rejoice at such news, as if the expedition was not destined to destroy me, to destroy the whites, to destroy the colony. With a mind such as his, essentially creative and orderly, this was the prospect which preoccupied him and warped his judgment. In France, I am represented as an independent power, and therefore they are arming against me, who refused General Maitland's offer to establish my independence under the protection of England, and who always rejected the proposals which Halifax made to me on the subject. He knew that the expedition was on its way, but still we hoped that somehow the coming catastrophe might be averted. Since, however, you wish to get out for France, I consent. But at least let your voyage be useful to the colony. I will send letters to the first consul by you, and I will entreat him to listen to you. Tell him about me. Tell him how prosperous agriculture is, how prosperous is commerce. In a word, tell him what I have done. It is according to all that I have done here what I ought, and that I wish to be judged. 20 times I have written to Bonaparte to ask him to send civil commissioners to tell him of the dispatch hither the old colonists, whites, instructed to administration or to administering public offices. Good machinists, good workmen, he has never replied. Suddenly he avails himself of the peace in order to direct against me a formidable expedition in the ranks which I see my personal enemies and people injurious to the colony whom I sent away. Come to me within 24 hours. I want you and my letters to arrive in time to make the first consul change his determination, to make him see that in ruining me, he ruins the blacks, ruins not only San Domingo, but all of the western colonies. If Bonaparte is the first man in France, Toussaint is the first man in the archipelago of the Antilles. He had no false modesty as to what he meant in San Domingo. He reflected for a moment, and then he sent a firm tone, and then he said in a firm tone he had been making arrangements for the English to get 20,000 blacks from Africa, but not for treachery, to make them soldiers of France. I know the perfidy of the English. I am under no obligation to them for the information that they gave me as to the expedition coming to San Domingo. No, I shall never arm for them. It's very interesting. So Toussaint here, he's speaking with the British. He wants to get 20,000 troops brought from Africa. And also the British are telling him that Napoleon sent his expedition to come and get you. So you can see the British are manipulating. So you can see how politics works, yeah? I took up arms for the freedom of my colour, which France alone proclaimed, but which she has no right to nullify. Our liberty is no longer in her hands. It is our own. We will defend it or perish. And that's very good. So he's going to say we can defend the abolition of slavery or we'll perish doing it. Even though we are for French, we will kill anybody who comes in here to try to enslave us again. This strange duality, so confusing to his people, who had to do the fighting, continued to the very end. And yet, In this moment of his greatest uncertainty, so different from his usual clarity of mind and vigour of action, Toussaint showed himself one of those few men for whom power is the means to an end, the development of civilization, the betterment of the fellow creatures. His very hesitations were a sign of the superior cast of his mind. Dessalines and Moyes would not have hesitated. He issued another proclamation and devoted most of it to reassuring the white proprietors, who will always find in us ardent protectors, true friends and zealot defenders. What did all this mean to the former slaves when he touched the expedition? The confusion of his mind was evident in every line. Men of good faith will not be any longer to believe in France. My apologies. Who abandoned San Domingo to herself at a time when her enemies disputed possession, will now send an army to destroy the men who have not ceased to serve her will. After the sowing doubts in the minds of the people as to the intention of the French, he continued, but it so happens that this crime for which the French government is suspected is real. It suffices for me to say that a child who knows the rights that nature has given him over it to the author of his days shows itself obedient and submissive towards its father and mother. And if in spite of its submissions and obedience, the father and mother are unnatural enough to wish to destroy it, there remains no other course than to place its vengeance in the hands of God. So God was to defend the blacks from slavery. What of the army and the people and himself, their leader? Brave soldiers, officers and rank and file did not listen to the wicked. I shall show you the road that you ought to follow. I am a soldier. I am afraid of no man. I fear only God. If I must die, it shall be as a soldier of honour, with no fear of reproach. Toussaint could not believe that the French ruling class would be so depraved, so lost to all sense of decency, as to try to restore slavery. His grasp of politics led him to make all the preparations, but he could not admit to himself and to his people that it was easier to find decency, gratitude and justice and humanity in a cage of starving tigers than in the councils of imperialism, whether in the cabinets of Pitt or Bonaparte, of Baldwin, Laval or Blum. This is the Afrocentricity Book Show. This is Brother Jegna. We are reading The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. Criticism is not enough. What should Toussaint have done? 150 years of history and the scientific study of revolution begun by Marx and Engels and amplified by Lenin and Trotsky justify us in pointing to an alternative course. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, after the October Revolution, faced much the same problem as Toussaint. Russian bourgeoisie culture was a relatively poor thing, but Lenin admitted frankly that it was superior to that of the proletariats, and would have used it until the proletariats had developed themselves. He rigidly excluded the bourgeoisie from political power, but he proposed that they should be given important posts and good salaries, higher than those of the Communist Party members. Even communists who have suffered and fought under Tsarism were after a time dismissed and replaced by competent bourgeoisie. We can measure Toussaint's gigantic intellect by the fact that, untrained as he was, he attempted to do the same. His black army and generals fleeing the political role of the Bolsheviks. If he kept whites in his army, it was for the same reason that the Bolsheviks also kept Tsarist officers. Neither revolution had enough trained and educated officers of its own, and the Black Jacobins, relatively speaking, were far worse off culturally than the Russian Bolsheviks. The whole theory of the Bolshevik policy was that the victories of the new regime would gradually win over those who had constrained to accept it by force. Toussaint hoped for the same. If he failed, it was for the same reason that the Bolsheviks, that the Russian Socialist Revolution failed. Even after all its achievements to defeat the revolutionaries in Europe, had the Jacobins been able to consolidate the Democratic Republican in 1974, the Republic in 1794, Haiti would have remained a French colony, but an attempt to restore slavery would have been most unlikely. It was in method and not in principle that Toussaint failed. The race question is subsidiary to the class question in politics, and to think of imperialism in terms of race is disastrous. But to neglect the racial factor is merely an incidental an error, only less grave than to make it fundamental. There were Jacobin workmen in Paris who would have fought for the blacks against Bonaparte's troops, but the international movement was not then what it is today. There was none in San Domingo. The black labourers saw only the old slave-owning whites. These would accept the new regime, but never to the extent of fighting against the French army, and the masses knew this. Toussaint, of course, knew this also. He never trusted Adjay, his chief of staff, who was a Frenchman, and asked Adjay's junior, Lamartine, to keep an eye out for him. But whereas Lenin kept the party and the masses thoroughly aware of every step and explained carefully the exact position of the bourgeoisie servants of the workers' state, Toussaint explained nothing and allowed the masses to think that the old enemies were being favoured at their expense. In allowing themselves to be looked upon and taking side of the whites against the blacks, Toussaint committed the unpardonable crime in the eyes of the community where the whites stood for so much evil. That they should get back their property was bad enough, but that they should be privileged was intolerable, and to shoot Moise, the black, for the sake of the whites was even more than an error. It was a crime. It was almost as if Lenin had Trotsky shot for taking the side of a proletariat against the bourgeoisie. Toussaint's position was extraordinarily difficult. Saint Domingo was, after all, a French colony. Granted that, before the expedition was a certainty, plain speech was impossible. Once he understood that it was coming, there should have been no hesitation. He should have declared that the powerful expedition could have no other aim than the restoration of slavery. Summoned by the population to resist, declared independence, confiscated the property of all those who refused to accept and distributed it among the supporters. Adjay and the other white officers should have been given a plain choice, accept or leave. If they had accepted, intended to be traitors, the black officers should have been on guard against them. The men would have known where they stood and would have shot them at the slightest vacillation before the enemy. The white should have been offered the same choice: accept the black regime, which was guaranteed and will guarantee your property, or leave. Traitors in wartime will be dealt with as all traitors in war. Many of the planters favoured independence. They would have stayed and contributed their knowledge, such it was, to the new state, not only for the former slaves, but followed Toussaint. Not only for former slaves had followed Toussaint. Lamartine was a mulatto, so white that only those who knew his origins could tell that he had African ancestry. He was absolutely and completely devoted to the cause of Toussaint. So was Maurepas, an old free black, and Dessalines, Belair, Moise, and hundreds of other officers, ex-slave and former free, would have been easy for Toussaint to get the masses of the population behind him. Having an army, some of the better educated blacks and mulattoes, and the labourers who would have supported him staunchly in everything. he would have been invincible. With the issue unobscured and his power clear, many who might otherwise have hesitated would have come down on his side that he was taking decisive action. With a decisive victory won, it was not impossible to reopen negotiations with a chastened French government to re-establish the hoped-for relations. It was the ex-slave labourers and the ex-slave army which would decide the issue, and Toussaint's policy crippled both. He left the army with a divided allegiance. There was a Frenchman in it whose duty would be to fight for France. They, the mulattoes and the old free blacks, had no fears about their liberty. Instead of bringing the black labourers nearer, he drove them away from him. Even after the revolt, it was not too late. Lenin crushed the Kronstadt's revolt with a relentless hand, but in a manner so abrupt as to call forth the protesters from sticklers for party discipline. He proposed a new economic policy immediately afterwards. It was the quick recognition of danger that saved the Russian Revolution. Toussaint crushed the revolt as he was bound to, but instead of recognizing the origin of the revolt as springing from the fear of the same enemy that he was arming against, he was sterner with his revolutionaries than he had ever been before. It happened that on the day on which Moyes was executed, November the 21st, was the very day fixed by Bonaparte for the departure of the expedition. Instead of reprisals, Toussaint should have covered the country, and in all the homely way that he understood so well, mobilized the masses, talked to the people and explained the situation to them, and told them what he wanted of them. As it was the policy he persisted in, reduced the masses to a state of stupor. He had been said that he was thinking of the effect in France. His severity, his proclamations reassuring the whites, aimed at showing Bonaparte that all the classes were safe in San Domingo, and that he could be trusted to govern the colony with justice. It was probably true, and his greatest his greatest condemnation. So Toussaint, this is where he really erred. He did everything He did everything mostly right. He had control of that. He was the most powerful man on the whole island, and he wanted to restore agriculture there, because you must remember that Haiti, or San Domingo as it was then, was the richest colony in the world, richer than all the 30 colonies of the USA, richer than all the British colonies put together as well. Crazy amount of wealth was created by the island, even though great loss of life was there. The Africans died like within 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Most of them died. They had to replenish the people, the Africans, the enslaved Africans, kidnapped Africans every year because they worked them so hard. So Toussaint wanted to, once he had the control of the island, he wanted to rule the colony San Domingo for France. He said, we could still create wealth for you. But when he wrote his constitution saying that basically I'm the ruler here, Bonaparte was not going to stand for that. So Bonaparte, obviously, the amount of wealth that came into San Domingo, San Domingo created maybe half or more than half of all French wealth, all French income. Half of French income came from this island. So without it, they was losing some big money. So obviously, Bonaparte wanted to take the island again to restore the coffers, to fill the coffers again, the French coffers with money. Because obviously he's fighting war all over Europe, fighting the British, yeah? And this time all the Europeans are fighting each other for colonies, just for wealth. So let me continue. Bonaparte was not going to be convinced by Toussaint's justice and fairness and capacity to govern. Where imperialists do find disorder, they create it deliberately, as Hedeville did. They want an excuse for going in, but they can find that easily and will go in even without any. It is force that counts, and chiefly the organised force of the masses. Always, but particularly at the moment of struggle, the leader must think of his own masses. It is what they think that matters, not what the imperialists think. There's a very, very good point there. He's thinking about what France thinks, what the whites think, yeah, what Europe thinks. He's not really thinking overwhelmingly what the masses of the people who is going to ensure they're not enslaved again, but he's not really looking to them. He's looking to the north all the time, Toussaint, which is another one of his failures. He kept looking for France. And to make matters worse, clear to them, Toussaint had to condone a massacre of the whites. So much the worse for the whites. He had done everything possible for them. And if the race question occupied the place, as it did in San Domingo, it was not the fault of the blacks, but Toussaint. Like Robespierre, destroyed his own left wing, and with it sealed his own doom. The tragedy was that there was no need for it. Robespierre struck at the masses because he was a bourgeoisie. Oops, excuse me. Just lost my page there, please bear with me. I'm just going to take a quick break, okay? And I'll be back. Okay, I'm back again. So Toussaint, his personal weaknesses, the adverse side of his strength, played his part also. He left even his generals in the dark, and naturally silent and reserved man, he had been formed by military discipline. He gave orders and escaped, and expected them to be obeyed. Nobody knew what he was doing. He said suddenly that Sonothax must go, and invited his generals to sign the letter, or not, as they please. When Vincent spoke to Christophe and Moyes about the constitution, they knew nothing about it. And Moyes' bitter complaint was that Toussaint and the whites came obviously from a man to whom Toussaint had never explained the motives of his policy. They would not have needed such persuasion to follow a bold lead. Moyes was feeling his way towards it. And if we can point out Toussaint's weakness all the more clearly, because Dessalines had actually found the correct method. His speech to the army were famous. And another version, he probably made it even more. He made it more than once. Ran this way. Excuse me. If France wishes to try any nonsense here, everybody must rise together, men and women. Loud acclaim greeted his bold pronouncement, worth 1,000 Toussaint's equivocal proclamations, reassuring the whites. Dessalines had not the slightest desire to reassure the whites. The whites were whites of the old regime. Dessalines did not care what they said or thought. The black labourers had to do the fighting, and it was they who needed reassurance. It was not that Toussaint had any illusions about the whites. He had none whatsoever. When the war had actually begun, he sent a curt message to his commanders. Leave nothing white behind you but the mischief that you have done. Yet Toussaint's error sprang from the very qualities that made him what he was. It was easy to see today, as the general saw after he was dead, where he had erred. He does not mean that they or any of us would have done any better in his place. If Dessalines could see so clearly and simply, it is because the ties that bound his uneducated soldier to France civilization were the slenderest. He saw what was under his nose so well because no further. Toussaint's failure was the failure of the Enlightenment, not his darkness. In the last days of December, the fleet of the Admiral Villaret-Joyeuse, bearing on board the first detachment of 12,000 men, sailed into the harbour in Samana Bay. Toussaint, standing alone on a neighbouring peak, watched the vessels. Unaccustomed to naval armaments, he was overwhelmed by their number. As he returned to his staff, he uttered the words, "We shall perish. All France has come to overwhelm us." It was not fear, he was never afraid, but certain traits of a character run deep in great men. And despite all that he had done, he was at bottom the same Toussaint who had hesitated to join the revolution in 1791, and for the whole month had protected his master's plantations from destruction. Only this time it was not a plantation and a few more slaves, but a colony and 100,000 of his people. So that is the end of chapter 12, and we're coming to the end now, so I think I'm going to wind it up there. We'll start with chapter 13 next week. To remind you, this is the Afrocentricity Book Show. Every Sunday between 4 and 6, we're reading The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. So we've got a little bit of time left there, so we're about 10 minutes left there. So I just want to talk about a little bit about Afrocentricity. Because the thing about Afrocentricity is that once you take on this kind of philosophy into your everyday life, you see things maybe differently from maybe you've seen them before. Okay? It allows you to have self-determination. It allows you to see things with your own views, your own values, your own interests, your own culture in mind. If anything runs contrary to your culture, we've got to reject it. Okay? So what is freedom? Freedom really is the ability to determine things. This Haitian Revolution, in the end, when 1804, when it became a new nation, this was true self-determination, because they determined their education, they determined their economics, their religion, their everything created, the politics of the nation. They determined everything what happened there. Yeah. Here now we haven't really got self-determination. We cannot dictate our politics, even though we can influence them slightly. We cannot dictate our economics because we haven't really created a strong economic base to do that at the moment. Yeah. Religion, we don't really follow our own religion really. We've been following religions that we've had either through enslavement or colonization. It's not really our religion. Yeah, we've got our own culture, our own religions, which are 1,000 years older than the people now whose religion we've kind of adopted. So it's very important to be able to determine our government, our laws, our livelihood, yeah, education. Education of our children is really a critical one. I know it's Malcolm X said that only a fool will allow the enemy to educate their children. Unfortunately, that's what our children there. So our children get maybe a slightly different views to us, and they pick up the norms, the values of the major society. So freedom is not even doing what you want, because at times our tastes and there. So sometimes what we think, what we want, I want to do this, but sometimes we're influenced by a wider society of our wants and our needs sometimes. So sometimes we think, I want this, but it could be influenced. It's really similar if you look at advertising, really. And you just get millions of advertising on TV, and you go into a shop and you just kind of make a beeline for things what you've been told. And you thought, well, that looks really good, but you've been kind of manipulated maybe to think about these things in a certain way. So even though you might think that it's your own views, it could be the views that really you've been conditioned to believe in these things. Yeah. So the Afrocentricity's goal is to bring around the African Renaissance. We can be who we are, and we can rise again to the top shelf. Because remember, we was always top shelf. Unfortunately, we've been kind of beaten down to our present position. So Afrocentricity gives us a specific view of the world, so we can move along together in unity, friendship, and we can really correct what we need. Because the key thing is really for our children. What our children are suffering at the moment, what we notice that happening in the streets of our children, it's not very good at the moment. Yeah. So it's only with our unity and our strength can we correct these things which we do see. So we've been dislocated as black people, as African people, yeah? We're not on our own centre. So we see the world maybe how maybe Europeans think things, similar to what Toussaint, we see in the book we're reading. He started to view the world maybe through the eyes, what does France think? What is the best for the white people there? Rather than what's best for you and your community and your family. And this is why I said the Haitian Revolution is a very excellent thing to keep an eye on. Because ultimately, Toussaint was kidnapped and taken away by the same people he thought that who loved him, or not necessarily loved him, because he knew who these people were, but he thought that maybe if I show them that I can be a good worker for them, they will trust me and they will accept me. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen. Certain people only understand strength and power. And power comes in many forms, but one way to really define power is the ability to make others act on your definitions as if it was their own. Do everybody understand that? So if power is to make people act on your definitions, how you define the world, as if the definitions were their own. So if we think of Stephen Lawrence's mum, Doreen, she had a power at one stage. Why? Because the laws were changed that before double jeopardy, if you're acquitted for one trial or one crime or offence, you can then be tried again. They've actually changed that rule. So the power that Doreen Lawrence brought forward there, it made these people change their own definitions to the definitions, because justice needs to be done. So it's very important to think of power as defining things. A lot of the time we're not really proactive. We kind of react to what other people have done. But with Afrocentricity in mind, African-centered thought in mind, you begin to define the world. We name the planets, our ancestors, name the planets, name the days of the week, name the months of the year, after themselves, after their own culture. The days of the weeks now, the thing we call them now, are like Roman gods, October or Roman generals and things like that. So they define the world after themselves. But that's not really us, we are not Europeans, We may be European nationals, we may have a passport. So your identity is really in two parts, really, in this modern world. Your identity is your nationality and your kin, or your blood, or your ethnicity. So I may have like a British passport, but equally I could have a French passport, or a Chinese passport, or a South American, or a Brazilian passport, But that's just my nationality, that's a bit of paper. However, my ethnicity is African. That will not change, see? So tomorrow I can say, I can maybe apply to become a Saudi Arabian citizen. And they may say, okay, you can be. So your nationality can change. However, your ethnicity never changes. If you're an African, you're an African. I think as Peter Tosh said, no matter who you come from, as long as you're a black man and woman, you're an African. So it's very important to define. Some of our children are confused about this. They think, I'm British. But British really on your passport, Your nationality. But you're African. That never changes. And you must remember, when we came from Africa many, many years back, of this kind of recent maybe 400 or 500 years, they didn't bring Jamaicans or British or anything from Africa. They brought Africans. But we dropped off one place, we became Jamaicans, we became African Americans, we became Bajans, stuff like that. But we were just African people. They didn't bring. So rather than focusing on where we landed, the key thing is really to focus on where we came from. And when you focus where you came from, then you know that you're a kind of African people. So we're just going to wrap up now. This is the Afrocentricity Book Show. It's very important to remember, people, and I say this every week, that what you do for yourselves depends on what you think of yourself. And what you think of yourself depends on what you know about yourself. And what you know about yourself depends on what you're taught about yourselves. So it's very important that we educate each other, each one teach one, so we understand the predicament we're in, because things are getting serious out there, All over the world, you see African people are under pressure. So it's very important to be who you are, because that is really our power, our strength, We go back to our ancestors, because our ancestors can give us power. So we're going to wind up now. This is the Afrocentricity Book Show. And don't forget to tune in again next week. The Afrocentricity Show between 4 and 6 p.m. So have a great week, and I'll see you then. One love.
cue me, or are you gonna tell me when to drive on in? Are you just gonna set it up? Cue me, or are you gonna tell me when to drive on in? Are you just gonna set it up? I was just waiting for those horns. Should be coming soon, right? What you feeling down for? No, I like that. Just vibing right now. Don't be sad. Open your eyes. The sun is shining. The angels are dancing in heaven. You hear me?
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up.